In world building, we often rely on familiar frameworks, historical analogs, logical cultural evolution, or the neat interplay of geography and resource distribution. But history teaches us that cultures are rarely rational, linear products of their material conditions alone. They're built together from subtle contradictions, forgotten forks in their own timelines, and alliances and tensions that never make it into the official record. In this video, we're going to talk about the negative space approach to cultural design. For the negative space approach to cultural design, begin at the fringes of belief. Cultures often define themselves more by what they deem implausible or undesirable than by their mainstream creeds. Identify absences. Before you list what a culture believes, note down 3 to 5 beliefs that they categorically reject. For example, a society might vehemently disbelieve in the concept of an afterlife, not because they rationally considered it, but because the taboo against the idea is deeply ingrained but never discussed openly. Ritualize the unthinkable. Determine which impossible notion they've layered rituals around. Maybe a ceremony for a concept that they collectively claim doesn't exist, like a hidden patron spirit or a forbidden future invention. And embody contradiction. Pick one figure, maybe a legendary trickster hero or a revered but misunderstood prophet who is revered precisely for pushing at the edges of what's acceptable, ensuring that the culture's stable center is always defined in some sort of opposition. Next, chart the cultural equations that don't add up for this culture. Humans and other beings live with cognitive dissonance every day. Embrace the fact that cultures endure contradictions instead of trying to resolve them neatly. First, list those contradictions. Identify at least 3 direct contradictions in their worldview. For example, people might consider themselves fiercely independent, yet hold fervent communal harvest festivals that demand absolute conformity of behavior. Discover hidden coalitions. Link a contradiction to a particular historical event, maybe a long past invasion that forced the culture to merge moral codes with foreign traditions. And those hybrid moral codes never synthesized fully, leaving these frictions. And then spotlight a subgroup that thrives because of these contradictions rather than despite of them. Maybe a cast of traveling judges who capitalizes on this moral gray zone, or nomadic astronomers who treat conflicting lunar calendars as their keys to power. The third step in constructing a culture from the negative space is to construct your norms from the wrong end of the telescope. The stable patterns of a culture are not just handed down. They emerge from failed experiments, misremembered histories, and imported ideas that were never meant to take root. So subvert the origin myth of your culture. Take the official origin myth and rewrite it from the perspective of an enemy culture. Force yourself to integrate 2 irreconcilable narratives into cultural memory. Which norms emerge when you're trying to harmonize 2 stories? Have mistranslated morals. Choose a core ethical guideline and imagine that it arose from a mistranslation of another culture's sacred text. How do people justify it now, having normalized this twisted or partial meaning? The fourth step to designing a culture from the negative space is to cultivate tension between private and public realities. Remember that norms in a culture are not monolithic. They differ dramatically between what's said in the plaza and what's whispered behind closed doors. Identify a private norm that completely contradicts the public norm. Maybe publicly everyone scorns the practice of fortune telling, yet in private everybody consults secret soothsayers before making major decisions. Are there whisper networks? Or you could have different underground communication networks, runners, coded textiles, tavern songs, and note how these private channels perpetuate a different set of insider norms than what's spoken publicly. The fifth step to designing a culture from the negative space is to institutionalize ephemeral beliefs. Some norms gain traction not because they're logical or beneficial, but because institutions crystallize them, sometimes around nothing more than a random whim that caught on. You could have erratic religious edicts, You insert at least one religious commandment that contradicts all reason into a culture, like a yearly ban on using metal tools that's kept alive by a priesthood that benefits from the confusion. Or embed pointless bureaucratic steps in maybe marriage rituals or land ownership processes that everyone complains about, but no one will remove because it ensures gatekeepers retain power. Maybe add institutionalized blame rituals, an official day of errors where the state symbolically punishes a statue representing a past leader's mistakes, which allows the current leaders to avoid scrutiny for their own misdeeds. The sixth step to building a culture from negative space is to forge alliances between incompatible norms. Remember that norms don't just stand alone. They survive by hooking into other cultural norms, even if those connections are illogical. So take a strange bedfellows approach to building norms. You compare a taboo norm, like never naming those who have passed on, with a socially critical norm, like commemorating ancestors through architectural motifs. And that tension can enforce creative solutions. Maybe a culture memorializes faces without naming them. Add cross cultural borrowing. Introduced at least one norm that was taken wholesale from a neighboring culture but's been twisted out of context. And the borrowed norm's survival can depend on its entanglement with local status rules. You could create periodic events designed to harmonize these contradictory norms, like a week when everyone pretends to believe in a cosmology that's otherwise rejected. The seventh step to building a culture out of the negative space is to engineer norms, create norms that self destruct or evolve. Remember, cultures are dynamic. Norms that seem eternal might and should actually be on the verge of transformation, or maybe be sustained by mechanisms designed to break them down periodically. So you could have rhythmic norm shifts, maybe a cyclical pattern where certain norms invert every generation. Maybe firstborn children are favored in one era and disfavored in the next, ensuring that no stable aristocracy forms. You could have deliberate obsolescence of norms, make norms that must be ceremonially taken out by a council of elders every century, and that the moment of that norm's destruction could spark debate, revealing underlying cultural insecurities. Or have norms that mutate by drift, except that storytellers, bards, historians subtly alter moral lessons each time they're retold, and map out how the narrative drift changes the normative landscape over decades. The eighth step to building a culture from the negative space is to embrace patterns of illegibility. So many cultural norms are not legible even to the people who practice them. They cause complexity and confusion as a feature, not a bug. Think about untranslatable rituals, maybe a core ritual that cannot be explained in any shared language, that persists because it's part of their identity and its meaning is found in doing, not understanding. You could have symbolic overload, flood the culture with symbolic markers, tattoos, totems, flags that mean different things to different subgroups, and norms that are stabilized not by their clarity, but by their ambiguity. And you can purposefully muddle, right? Allow authorities to keep certain explanations vague. And that vagueness can prevent single interpretations from monopolizing the culture's norms, making those norms survive and be able to change over time. The ninth step to building a culture from the negative space is to integrate invisible actors and forces. So the principle here is that the drivers of cultural norms are not always human or even sentient or publicly acknowledged. So you could have norms that are solely shaped by non-human factors. Maybe there's a seasonal fungus bloom that by coincidence aligns with inheritance rituals, giving it mystical significance. Maybe that fungus actually affects the minds of the people during that time. You can have unseen manipulators, maybe a secret guild or an uncharted machine from ancient times that subtly influences diet or naming conventions. The culture's norms could be partly engineered by these invisible actors. Or inexplicable taboo sources, taboos with no explanation. People say avoid a certain mountain peak or word not because of any recorded event, but because they've always done so. Consider if maybe some long lost source set this norm, but there's no need to explain it in your story. The 10th step to designing a culture from the negative space is to constantly reassess and disobey your own rules. True cultural depth in your creation arises when your process is fluid and it's critical. Don't hold your world's culture's norms as final truths. Keep testing and contradicting those ideas and let them evolve. Have authorial contradictions. After establishing norms, choose some of them to undermine in future stories. This negative space approach to building cultures refuses neat consensus, static tradition, and a frictionless integration of ideas, and instead it asks you to craft cultural norms from the inside out. Highlight contradictions, neglect clarity, embed illusions, and capture those subtle forces that shape societies over generations. Thanks for watching. If you like this video or like the work of the procedural map generator, please like and subscribe below.